Paul Brown. The eviction moratorium was a welcome relief to a lot of people, but what exactly are renters' rights and what are eviction protections during this COVID-19 crisis? Well, there are a lot of questions, but we have people here that have a lot of answers. I'm delighted to welcome to the studio Curren Price, council member for 9th District here in the city of Los Angeles, and Rushmore Cervantes from the LA Housing and Community Development. First of all, I want to state to you, Councilman Price, you have an amazingly large and interesting district. You know, it's very dynamic. It's got a lot of cultural institutions,
Yes.
a lot of high-density housing. The dynamic of where you are actually responsible is very impressive. Can you sort of share a little bit about what that?
Sure. Well, we are located in South Los Angeles. District 9 is home to LA Live, the Convention Center, USC, Exposition Park, including the Coliseum, the new soccer stadium, the to-be Lucas Museum.
Right.
But we also, and those are really high visibility, iconic structures in our community, not just in CD9, but in our city. However, in CD9, we also have high rates of poverty, high rates of dropouts in our schools. We probably have the second highest concentration of homeless encampments. You know, but we've got citizens who work hard, who get up, work hard, really care about their community, care about families, care about their kids, and are determined to really make a difference.
Right.
Of the 250,000 residents who live in CD9, about 1/3 are under 18. And so we have a real special focus on making sure that we have resources available for our kids, for our youth, and for our seniors to provide a kind of quality of life that will make it important for them.
You've seen so many changes there, I'm sure, in a very short period of time. So.
Well, we see the changes, and we of course are subject to the trials and tribulations, current and future tribulations, and so people are trying to make it. They're uncertain. These are uncertain times for all of us, and so it's important that government be as positive and as consistent and as responsive as possible, and that's what we try to do in CD9.
And speaking of resources, Rushmore, it's an amazing resource that I was not really familiar with until we had the good fortune of meeting a few weeks ago. The Housing and Community Development of Los Angeles is something that people can really access when they have questions.
Absolutely. Well, first, we provide a variety of services and programs. We do all the financing for affordable housing and supportive housing throughout the city of Los Angeles, provide first-time homebuyer program. We have 16 family source centers located throughout the city, and you may have heard they're the ones that are actually helping the city of Los Angeles disseminate the Angelino cards to those that are most in need. We provide a whole array of social services, and of course we are responsible for working with landlords and tenants to address the housing needs, both from a monitoring perspective, but also the tenant rights and ensuring that property owners know what their responsibilities are. And as the city of LA, and certainly the Councilman Price, the full council and the mayor, and showing their leadership, have really stepped up to try to create some safety nets for the constituents across the city, creating this moratorium, which we're responsible for enforcing and in disseminating information across the city.
Well, speaking of information, I know there are so many questions, and by the way, if anyone has any questions, you know, we are taking questions, and we're going to try to get to as many questions from people who are watching as we possibly can, but let's get right to it. So, Councilman Price, how is the city of Los Angeles stepping up to bring relief to tenants, and not in just in your district, but all across the city?
Well, of course, this emergency is something that's being felt worldwide, you know, and here in California, here in Los Angeles, it's equally pronounced. We know that we read the papers every day that it's not just a health issue, but it's also an economic issue. And we're very, very, very sensitive to that. We know that individuals need to survive, and they want to make sure that they have resources that they can access and that can be responsible for them. So we know that in LA, for example, about 60% of the citizens rent. 60% are renters. In CD9 and other parts of LA, South LA, that number's probably 80%. So going into this crisis, I think the council was very sensitive to making sure that we have programs and policies in place that help preserve housing, that don't get rid of it, but help preserve it and make sure that it's available. So the council has done a couple of things. One, there was a moratorium on evictions, which was very significant. We don't want people being kicked out during this time of uncertainty. People are getting laid off, uncertainty about their medical condition. So we put a freeze on evictions. That's at commercial and residential evictions. Similarly, we put a freeze on the RSO units, housing units. In other words, those rent increases are frozen, and they will not be implemented during this crisis period. And then finally, for those tenants who have been unable to pay, we're going to give them about 12 months after the emergency is over to make up those payments. And so we're trying to be flexible, we're trying to be responsible, but we want to encourage greater communication with the tenants and the landlords.
You mentioned a couple different types of renters, those that rent houses and those that rent business, but at Rushmore, exactly who specifically do all these renter protections apply? Everyone across the board?
There's distinctions between RSO and non-RSO or rent stabilization ordinance. It's important for constituents to understand what type of housing they're renting in, and they can easily text. RSO to 855-880-7368, and they can easily find out if their property is subject to the RSO or not. And the reason why that's important, the moratorium on evictions, as Councilman Price indicated, is across the board. However, the rent increases are only those that are covered under the RSO, and they have up to a year for those rents to even go into place. So,
and say what the RSO is.
Rent stabilization ordinance, and it's those properties that are they're built prior to October 1st, 1978, and that represents about 80% of the multifamily housing stock in the city.
How much?
80% of the multifamily housing stock in the city. It's about 80%.
I'm just learning so much. 60% of Los Angeles rents, except in 9, which is about 80%, and all of that's an amazing statistic. Yes. So I can imagine how precarious this whole balance has been.
And because the balance, if I may, also is that within the city of LA, certainly within Council District 9, about 65% of the housing stock are 4 units or less, which typically means what they call a mom and pop. There's not these big corporations owning these apartments. So you've got a community of renters, but also mom and pop owners of those properties. So it's an interesting dynamic between the issues of not being able to pay their rent, but also the inability necessarily to pay their mortgages.
Okay, so the next question is, this is very uncertain times. This is a very fluid situation. It changes minute by minute. It's changed since we've been sitting here. But how long are these rental protections in place, Councilman?
Well, they went into effect earlier this month, I think around the 4th or so.
Right.
And it will be in effect through the end of the mayor's stay-at-home initiative. We don't know when that's going to be. Initially the thought was it would end about the 15th of May. There's some indication now that it may be longer than that. But it will just last until it's determined that the Safe at Home ordinance is passed.
So people have to stay informed because,
Correct. Stay informed. Make sure that you're in communication with your landlord, with the council office, and with HCID if you have any questions about what's going on.
Okay, and speaking of, if anybody has any questions, do these rental protections apply to absolutely all evictions? I mean, are there any exceptions as to if you can end up in a situation which you're...
In the city of Los Angeles and the entire state of California, there's an eviction moratorium.
Okay.
The city of Los Angeles specifically, beyond just your inability to pay the rent for whether you've lost a job or had a reduction in your wages, whether you've got child care issues because your children are out of school, or you have increased child care expenses, or you're caring for a loved one or yourself that's sick, or maybe even a government issue, there's no evictions that are allowed. Furthermore, property owners cannot what they call Ellis their property, and this is a state law that enables property owners to withdraw their property from the housing market. So there is an order in place that will not allow property owners at this time to evict any tenants and to initiate any kind of Ellis Act at this time, because we want to make sure that everyone is able to stay at home. We don't want to create an environment where people are under pressure to, 1, pay their rents if they can't pay their rents, 2, to provide documentation if they don't have the documentation. But really, most importantly, we want to make sure that we create a stable community while we're going through this collectively as a society to ensure that they remain at home. And again, as the councilman indicated, giving them that breathing room to be able to pay that rent over the next 12 months. There
are different, as you mentioned, there are different types of landlords, you know,
Yes.
the mom and pop, the major corporations, and then those that own these pieces of property. So where do they fit in regards to any of this assistance?
Well, property owners are handled a bit differently. Typically, they have to work with their banks. I will say that for those property owners that are watching, they should find out for certain what type of loan they've got. If it's been backed by the federal government, either Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, or it's been guaranteed, such as a Department of Agriculture or Veterans Administration or FHA loan. The federal government has authorized 6 months forbearance of payments for property owners if they have loans that are backed or guaranteed by what I just mentioned, and they can also request an additional 6 months thereafter. So there's that opportunity, at least from the lending perspective, and then the federal government and at the local level, there are SBA loans that can be sought and granted. I know that the city of LA has its own SBA loan program, small amount, but certainly there's monies to be had. And then furthermore, if people want to go on our website, hcidla@lacity.org, we have a drop-down menu of different resources for property owners to find out what additional resources may be available to them.
And so much of this is a learning curve of learning these different categories and these different types of evictions, or, you know, these different, as you were mentioning, RSO, et cetera. But so the thing I was curious, there are different types of evictions. One is an at-fault eviction.
Right.
And how do they fit into this particular scenario?
Essentially, there's no fault and at fault. I'll just
Okay.
go briefly. No fault is an example if you're living in an apartment and the property owner wants to move his daughter in there, or he wants to create another manager unit. Well, right now, that's not allowed.
Okay.
Furthermore, at fault is when is a violation of the lease agreement. Typically, that means is you haven't made a payment. Under this current moratorium, you can't get evicted. There will be some instances, rare exceptions, in which you still get evicted, and that would be for illegal usage of the unit, whether you're doing drugs, gang-related things like that. That's more of a, that's a civil issue, but there would be grounds there. But by and large, the lay of the land right now is pretty much there are no evictions, but for rare exceptions. And I also understand the state has just, I think yesterday or the day before, has indicated that there will be no trials for evictions right now. So essentially everything's been put on hold while we go through this crisis together as a state and a city.
But you're encouraging, as I said, tenants to communicate with landlords, landlords who communicate with tenants, landlords who communicate with their mortgage companies. It's important that we keep the line of communication open so that everyone knows what's happening. These are trying times, they're difficult times. And while there are periods of forbearance, it doesn't mean that rents are going to be eliminated. And so
Sure.
folks must still be responsible as they move forward.
And of course, information is a critical component of all of this. And unfortunately, there's good information, there's bad information. I had the good fortune of looking at your website. Very clean, very understandable, very
Thank you.
easy to access. But, what do you say to people who need information, and Angelenos in particular, because of, we're still kind of in the middle of all
Right.
of this.
Well, again, we're encouraging neighbors to certainly contact the council office if you have a question. Contact HCID if you have a question. Communicate with each other. As I said, the important thing is to make sure that the lines of communication are open between the tenant and the landlord, so that if the tenant is having some issues, some difficulties, the landlord is aware of it. There are protections that the landlord, that the tenant has, but there's some rights that the landlord also has. And so it's important, as you said, to get the information out. If there are questions, if there are concerns, if there's something that is not clear, ask. Now is the time.
Are you getting a lot of inquiries to your
Absolutely.
office?
We're getting lots of inquiries. People are concerned about being kicked out. They're concerned about not being able to find a place to live. Housing is a big deal, especially in CD9. We probably have more affordable housing units in the pipeline in other parts of the city. So we're sensitive to the fact that we need to have housing, and housing of all types. Not just special needs. We want some market rate housing. We want 1-2 bedrooms to accommodate families and larger. We want the whole spectrum. And so during these times of crisis, it really underscores the fact that how important housing is and how important having information is. The mayor says we should be staying at home, and we want to make sure that folks have a home to stay in
Right.
during this pandemic and then after.
Right. And I would imagine that your office is getting inundated as well.
Absolutely. Well, May 1st is tomorrow. That's rent day. And we're asking any person that's watching here that if they feel like they can't make a full payment or partial payment, they should notify their property owner or property manager ASAP as soon as possible. And we even have on our website a form that they can complete, easily downloadable, and provide that information to their property owner to advise them. At least we ask within 7 days of when the rent is due. So at least they're on notice the fact that they're unable to pay unfortunately due to COVID-19, they're unable to pay their rent. But the communication is really critical because, of course, the property owner has to understand what checks are coming in and what's not coming in as well. So we ask that there's communication be had on both sides, and HSIDs can certainly walk both landlords and tenants through what their rights are and what resources are available to them.
Given the fact that tomorrow is, rent day, there's usually a little bit of a window in which your rent is considered late. There probably is something that you should put in place in your own mind. So what's the ideal process if you find yourself looking a few days ahead and you realize, or a month ahead, or even tomorrow, and realize you can't do it? You said make sure you call your landlord, but should there be maybe something established in advance of that in order to help protect, even as you mentioned, the landlord's financial scenario?
Well, we ask as soon as possible. If you don't think that you can pay that rent, we ask you to tell them today. I mean, it's important that everyone understand what's coming down the pipeline. There's an easy form that can be filled out, or just a regular communication with them in something in writing to just let them know that they can't pay. And the landlord cannot demand proof of documentation as to why.
Oh, interesting.
That's correct. And then furthermore, the property owner cannot demand that the tenant enter into a repayment agreement. That's not required under the local or the state orders right now. The tenants have the ability to pay back the arrearages, the forbearance amount, within 12 months. It doesn't specify on day one. It doesn't specify over a 12-month period of time. It specifies within 12 months following the end of the pandemic. So it's
kind of
important
a handshake loan.
It is a part of a lease agreement, and of course, the assumption is they will remain in place. Once the COVID-19 pandemic is over, they'll be responsible to once again begin making their payments. But the amount of rent that they did not pay during this forbearance period, that would just be added, and we would recommend that the tenants work out a payment plan with their property owners as opposed to waiting for the 365th day in order to repay. It would actually make fiscal prudent sense to be able to work some sort of payment arrangement out with the property owner as well.
Even if they move within that 12-month period.
You would be responsible for that. That's correct.
And we're encouraging neighbors to maintain their records. They may not need to submit anything to the landlord to prove that they can't pay, but they should be keeping track of payment stubs if it's been a reduction, or maybe they got a letter from the employer about a reduction in hours. Bills, medical bills, maybe child care expenses, anything that is associated with the difficulty one is having associated with this COVID-19. Keep your records.
I'm wondering, does the city have any power to push for rent and mortgage forgiveness during all of this?
Well, unfortunately, we don't. I mean, we can't mandate to a mortgage company that they should not accept payments or be prohibited from making payments. That kind of an order probably is more appropriate at the state level or federal level in terms of authorization to make something like that happen. But we are, again, encouraging folks to work closely with their landlords. Let landlords know what's going on, what their issues are, what their concerns are. The city does not have the authority, the power to just willy-nilly reduce payments or to prevent them from being made.
Right.
We certainly have been having some discussions at the state level and federal level about the desirability of that kind of approach. But currently, we do not have that power, we don't have that authority, and we want to make sure that citizens are in compliance to the extent possible.
Well, it's actually nice to hear that there is conversation, because there is this issue of this wasn't anyone's choice.
Correct.
That this ended up being something that was necessary for the well-being of all, and that still that put people in a situation in which they had no choice in order to make or not make money, pay their rent,
Right.
not pay the rent. So it's nice to hear that at least there's a sensitivity.
And kind of piggybacking on The action, we referenced the 12-month extension that people have to make their
Right.
payments. Again, part of the protection that the council built in, that there are no late fees, there's no interest that will be charged for that period of time. Again, we're trying to make it easy, we're trying to make it sensitive to both sides. We realize it's a tough time and we all have to work together.
Right.
Fortunately, the city of LA is a unique situation where 65% of the multifamily housing stock is covered by the rent stabilization ordinance,
nice.
which is significant. And actually, I think it's closer to 80%. I stand corrected. But furthermore, what the city council did last week is they instructed the city attorney to come back with an ordinance that'll probably be presented next week that will, again, relative to the increase in rents, which are allowable under the RSO, they can't be implemented or can't be collected for a year.
Oh,
So,
okay.
so during this COVID-19 crisis, the property owner cannot initiate a rent increase. They can 6 days afterwards, but they can't be collected within a 12-month period of time. So as people are trying to get back on their feet, they won't see a
Huge bump.
a bump in their rent. So
Right.
it's another way for the council and the mayor to be able to protect the tenants.
So obviously, it feels as if everyone knows that there's this moratorium. It feels as if every landlord and every tenant should have the understanding that that an eviction cannot take place. But what happens if, in fact, someone does receive an eviction notice? Do they have any rights or privileges at this moment?
They do. They should contact HSID immediately. Well, first, they should stay in place. Don't panic.
Don't
They should
move.
call-
Don't feel you have to get.
Yeah,
Because it's a scary notice.
It's
a very
scary
scary
notice.
notice.
It's a scary notice, and we want everyone to know, both landlords and tenants alike, you're not allowed to do this right now. And if there's, stay in place to the tenants, contact us, and we'll walk you through what your rights are to be able to address this. Again, there's no reason for them to be receiving that notice, and like I mentioned earlier, the courts aren't going to be taking it anyway. So if there's any intimidation taking place, even though this moratorium's in place, we can't weed out bad actors. Just like, we've got a police force, doesn't mean there's not going to be crime. The fact is that we work very closely with the city attorney's office. We've got bad apples out there that are intimidating their constituents at this particular time, intimidating tenants to force them out. We will be there to hold their hand through this process. We actually have free legal services that we offer up through nonprofits that we coordinate with, as well as we work with the city attorney's office to prosecute when necessary.
Wow.
But again, if a tenant receives that kind of a notice, they should keep it. Keep it as evidence, to show what the landlord attempted to do. But know that you do have rights. If you have any concerns, you should be calling the office. As I said, contact the council office, contact HSID directly. And that goes for tenants and for landlords. There will be questions on either side, and we want to make sure that folks are getting the correct information accurately and that they can use.
Along with that, I mean, you mentioned when you were talking about you don't need to prove that you are in
At the time.
at this, but you should probably have something eventually to demonstrate that you were in need during this COVID
That's
crisis.
correct.
So along with, if you do get this eviction notice, which I hope that no one does, but if you do get that, what are other pieces of documentation that you should just collect? Even the most obscure?
Well, as I said before, maybe it's a pay stub that shows that there was a dramatic loss of income, or a notice of termination, or being laid off, any receipts of associated expenses, either medical or child care or other expenses associated with your tenancy, that could impact your failure and ability to pay at that time.
What if you don't have anything official? Can you actually just write notes, date notes or something? Is there some, because I imagine that there are people that may be undocumented or something, and they don't have any kind of governmental paperwork, they don't have any kind of employment paperwork, but they are still in this situation.
Well, first of all, being your immigration status has nothing to do with your eligibility for these benefits.
Okay.
In other words, you don't have to show that you that you have papers in order to qualify. Anyone who's a resident qualifies. But it's just important, as I said before, to keep track of any information, any data, any letter, any note that you receive that suggests that you need to leave or you need to move. Make sure that you can document that.
Okay.
And furthermore, if I may say, is that they can contact HSID, and if they provide us information, we'll provide them a letter that'll go both to the landlord and tenant that will affirm the fact that the tenant is unable to pay due to an income reduction or has no income whatsoever. And that tenant, at a later point, if it's necessary, could use that as an affirmative defense in court. Now, I don't want to scare people that are watching this because of the moratorium, we're not going to see a whole litany of lawsuits or evictions because of the fact that the courts aren't taking it too. That's illegal to evict for that reason. So what the councilman is referring to is just in case, and you may just need that as an affirmative defense just in case. And again, but the city will have services available to them if necessary to defend themselves.
There's a lot of jargon, and you've shared the information about it, but here's one that I don't know what this is, an unlawful detainer. What is an unlawful detainer?
Well, typically what happens is if a tenant doesn't pay their rent, they get a 3-day notice to pay or quit. Got it. At day 4, they haven't paid, then the property owner will file a lawsuit against that tenant, and it's called an unlawful detainer. It basically requires a court to be able to authorize the vacancy of that unit. So that's a 3-day notice to quit first, and then an unlawful detainer thereafter. Okay, so in either case,
it's a progression of.
It is a progression, and if anyone is receiving either a 3-day notice to quit or an unlawful detainer, first of all, again, stay in place. Do not ignore any of them. Either of those notices, you need to pick up the phone immediately and contact HSID.
Councilman, is there anything happening with the landlords if they violate any of this? I mean, is there anything that
Well, yeah, there are, again, protections that tenants have against landlords that are acting improperly or illegally. Mm-hmm. And if they've been in those situations, they should contact, as I said, our office, HSID's office or the council office, so that they can be referred to the city attorney for proper referral. If there's a question about either a letter received or it could be a verbal communication that suggests that you've got to leave or you've got to move or you've got to get out or you've got to pay, that's when you kind of raise the red flag and say, wait a minute, let me get some additional information.
Because I can't fathom if people end up on the streets in this scenario. I mean, this would just make it so much worse. So all of these protections in place had to be put in place very quickly. And do they seem to be working?
Well, they do. It's not perfect, but it certainly is keeping people in their residence. That's why events like this are so important. Getting the word out, letting folks know what their rights, responsibilities are, especially in these times, because the council has taken some special action to protect those we feel are more vulnerable to this kind of a situation than would be otherwise.
And small businesses too, I imagine, because you talk about people's livelihoods.
Absolutely.
And now they've lost that, and yet they still have the responsibility mm-hmm. for wherever lease they have.
Yes, they do. And as Richmond pointed out, many of our property owners are small mom and pop operations. They may own 2 or 4 or 6 units. Part of their retirement, and they're counting on that income to make their mortgage payment. And if they can't, then they're going to be in difficulty. So we've got to be sensitive all the way around.
Right. And what's the policy? What happens when all this is over? When this declaration of emergency is over, then what happens?
Well, I think that's where a different level of administration comes in and another level of communication, because post 60 days out, this is when most of the orders are over, but then you've got a year to start repaying. So I think there's going to be, over that next year period beyond the COVID-19 ending, there's going to be a lot of hand-holding, a lot of education to both landlords and tenants to ensure that they are making their payments. And at the end of that 12-month period of time, hopefully the tenants have been able to rectify the arrearages in those rents, and hopefully the landlords have been able to collect and be able to make sure that they're able to maintain their properties and pay their mortgages at the same time. So I think that this is just because hopefully, this is a health issue, also a fiscal issue, but that fiscal issue is going to be in place for at least a year as we recover from this COVID-19.
Yes. Recover is a good word. We're going to use that word again and again. We're all going to get through this. Well, Councilman Price and Rushmore, all of this is fascinating information, and I know that people have a lot of questions, and I really want to thank both of you for answering them. But we will be right back. Hello, welcome back. We're talking about renters' rights and eviction protections during this COVID-19 crisis. Of course, I'm delighted to be joined by Councilman Price, but we have a new guest with us right now, Silvana Naguib. She's the supervising attorney with the Homelessness Prevention Project. So you have a lot of information about protecting people from becoming homeless, which is one of the issues that we're dealing with in regards to all this renters protection. So a little bit about what the Homelessness Project is. I'm fascinated about what you do to help prevent people from being unhoused.
So thank you for having me. I'm an attorney with a nonprofit law firm called Public Counsel, and we actually practice in a lot of different areas of law, but my specific area of practice is as a housing attorney doing homelessness prevention. And the primary way that we prevent people from becoming homeless is defending them in evictions, or what's known as unlawful detainers, and trying to address, if we can, the reason that the person is facing homelessness, trying to solve it in collaboration with community service organizations, and also taking legal action to make sure that they are not evicted as the result of a lawsuit.
Have you noticed an uptick during this pandemic?
Well, actually, things have slowed down considerably because of a lot of the protections that have been put in place by the city council, by the governor, by the courts, both locally and statewide. But I'm still getting calls from tenants and from people who work with tenants, case managers, community service providers, family members, about people who are not able to pay their rent, and some of whom are still receiving eviction notices or notices from their landlord. So even though things are not much is happening in court, there's still a lot happening in people's lives with respect to their status as a renter.
So what should they do if they're being harassed by their landlord right now? Because this moratorium, you would think that that wouldn't happen, but as you mentioned, people are still receiving information, so what can they literally do if their landlord is harassing them with phone calls or notices or something like that?
So there's a couple of different things that people can do. One is you can ask your landlord to communicate with you only via email or text message, and that way the communications will be preserved if down the road there's an eviction action or you need to, you need to reach out to HSID. We also, if people are receiving eviction notices, actually legal notices, they should definitely reach out to HSID right away to seek assistance, and they should also seek legal assistance as well. If you go on HSID's website, there's actually a link to a list of legal referrals, and it has a list of all of the nonprofits in Los Angeles that assist low-income people with evictions. There's also the Shriver Self-Help Center at the downtown courthouse that's taking calls via their 1-800 number, and you can find that on the HSID website as well, so that people can get assistance if they are receiving notices. But what we advise people if they're receiving calls or emails or texts from their landlord is, set aside some time. Say, I'm going to check on these once a week and I'm going to send one response. You don't have to respond to every email, you don't have to respond to every text, and you don't have to respond to every call. We understand landlords are hurting for money as well.
And you can always contact the council office, our district office or city hall number, so that we can also help direct you to the correct assistance.
I can't imagine what it was like in council chambers when all of this began, because it's already an issue in the city of Los Angeles, protecting people from being unhoused, those that are currently unhoused. I would imagine the conversation was very pointed, very specific, and very energized when all of this began.
Well, it certainly has been, and the statistics have shown, for example, that disproportionate rates of death are occurring in black and brown communities, like the one I represent. And so we're real sensitive to making sure, certainly addressing some of the systemic problems, lack of adequate housing and resources, et cetera. But during this crisis period, certainly making sure that people have access to testing, that they have access to programs. You mentioned the homeless situation. Two of our rec centers are housing homeless individuals, people experiencing homelessness now. They total about over 100. In addition to that, we have a bridge housing site on Hope Street that's again housing our homeless neighbors and trying to provide resources so that they can transition into a more stable life. But this has thrown everyone to a tizzy. People are afraid, they're concerned, and we want to make sure that we provide the information people need to survive.
It's also, tragically, but still very importantly, a learning scenario for you, I'm sure, in a position of authority, as well as, you know, for you in a position of advocacy, to understand what the needs of the community are now, not and in the future, because I imagine you're hearing from people that you might not have heard from before, or you're learning about things that you might not have known in a non-pandemic scenario. So I imagine this is sort of going to inform things that happen in the future when we're out of a crisis.
Well, it does. As a matter of fact, I initiated a pilot program to help identify individuals who are slipping into homelessness. In other words, a homeless prevention effort that we've talked about before. In other words, what can we do to help an individual or a family prevent them from going into homelessness? Maybe it's a bill for the utilities or for food or a rental payment. We've got to be more creative. We have to be more expansive in how we deliver those services, how we identify those needs, and how we deliver those services, and to try to encourage a real collaboration between agencies like Public Council, the city council offices, city departments. We are all in this together.
You know, we spoke a little bit about the fact that evictions, there's a moratorium on evictions, but, you know, scenarios happen, and I'm sure you've seen this. You know, someone is paying the rent, but the landlord insists they have to go anyway. What kind of protections do they have right now in regards to reaching out, or what they say or how they say it? You know, the landlord is bullying them in a way.
Well, you know, in that situation, I think it's really important to seek legal assistance as soon as possible so that you can have a qualified attorney help you sort of sort through any notices you've received, anything in writing, and give you legal advice as to how to proceed. Because, you know, if it's a no-fault eviction, those are prohibited right now. So if the landlord is saying that you're violating the lease in some way, then that's not a no-fault eviction. So what you really need is some legal advice to determine, well, what is the real reason that my landlord is trying to evict me? Is this a permitted reason? What are the court rules that apply? Because, you know, it was mentioned by Mr. Cervantes but there are some narrow exceptions to this current pause on evictions. And there's this public safety exception. And so we think it's really important for tenants to pay attention to any documents that you receive, anything that's happening with respect to your tenancy, and seek legal advice, because you might be one of those people that falls into one of those exceptions, and that you're going to need legal assistance immediately.
Is it possible you're in one of those exceptions if in fact you were in the middle of an eviction before this moratorium took place?
You know, that's actually a major area of concern for our organization, and for me personally, because I have a lot of clients that I've been representing who were in serious danger of being evicted before any of this happened, right? It's important to remember that in an ordinary year, between 40,000 and 50,000 evictions are filed in Los Angeles County. That's without a pandemic. That's without, you know, the greatest economic recession of my lifetime. And so this is already a serious issue for Angelenos, especially, you know, poor and working people in Los Angeles, where their housing is insecure because they are so rent burdened. You know, there's a huge proportion of people in Los Angeles that pay over 50% of their income to rent. So it's already a precarious situation. So we're very concerned about those landlords who had this believe that their tenant was on the way out the door because they had already filed an eviction, it was already in progress, and now everything is stalled. And so I regret to say that we are seeing some instances of harassment of those tenants because those landlords were expecting that those tenants were going to be moving out, and now they're not able to.
Are the evictions mostly due to non-payment of rent? Is that where the bulk of evictions come from?
I would say in general, yes, but there's plenty of evictions that are no-fault evictions, and there's also evictions that are related to an alleged violation of the lease. This brings up another important point that I want to mention, which is that, you know, one of the major issues that we see for people who are paying the rent is they might be being evicted because they have a pet and they're not authorized to have a pet under their lease, or they have an extra occupant who's not on the lease. And that's considered a breach of lease, and then you would have to go to court and determine, you know, who's in the right. But you know, the city council has passed protections that if you have extra occupants or pets in your apartment because of COVID-19, that is not a valid basis for eviction. So, you know, if your parent or your sibling had to move in with you because you needed to take care of them, or whatever the reason was, they couldn't go back to home, that's not a valid basis for eviction.
One of the things about Los Angeles that is so, I mean, obviously it's a very high rent environment, period. And, in District 9, I know that there are a lot of changes happening and there's a lot of growth and some of it good, some of it not so good, but rents go up.
Yes.
And rents are becoming almost untenable for a lot of people. How do you, as a councilman, balance that? Because obviously you want a healthy district.
Absolutely.
But at the same time, and a progressive district, but at the same time protecting those who
Yeah.
you care about.
Well, as I said before, affordable housing is a real concern and a real issue in my district. And so we have authorized, as I said, thousands of units of housing, quote, affordable. And we know that that's just part of the solution. We got to provide other kinds of assistance as well. And this housing needs to be all over the city. We don't just want affordable projects concentrated in CD9 or just in South LA. They should be citywide. And so, it's a matter of certainly encouraging greater development, but also making sure that there's not a over-concentration of affordable just in one part of town.
Sure, and dealing with this entire eviction process and everything like that. As you mentioned, the courts have, in essence, shut down except for critical cases. Is that true?
Yes, so the presiding judge of the Los Angeles Superior Court has issued an order which does a number of things to protect tenants. One is that essentially all cases that are in progress are essentially on hold until further notice, and I've actually been receiving those notices in the mail on the cases on which I'm the attorney, saying, this due to the pandemic, this case is on hold until further notice. So the problem is, once things start to open back up,
You are never going to sleep again.
right, and as tenant advocates, we're very concerned because we know that there already weren't enough lawyers to meet the demand for legal representation for tenants. And there's going to be so many more evictions, as well as all the ones that were already in progress, all the evictions that have nothing to do with COVID-19, and all the evictions for the folks that aren't able to pay rent now because they've lost their jobs. So that's why we're really advocating for people whose housing is in jeopardy to seek legal assistance now, because we can help you now. We're all working remotely. Everyone's at home doing Zoom calls, and we've been doing intakes over the phone with clients, because if everyone waits until this is all over, there's not going to be enough lawyers in order to help all the people that need help.
And what is happening from a council, from a council perspective? Because you're right, what happens after this is over and there's a huge a tidal wave into the courts, or people are now in a position in which maybe they can't pay their rent back that they are now indebted to. So are there thoughts going into making decisions?
Well, certainly programs like this are important. Just
Absolutely.
Getting the word out, keeping people informed in real time as we're moving through this crisis. As you mentioned, things are changing almost on a daily basis. The council is committed, though, to providing some certainty, some stability, especially amongst the majority of individuals in our city who are renters. We certainly understand and appreciate the unique role that property owners play, that landlords play, but tenants are especially vulnerable, especially during this time. And so we want to make sure that everyone is aware, is informed, and that they're taking advantage of resources available to assist them during this time of crisis.
This is a scary question to ask, but have you received any notification that someone has been locked out or have not been able to get into their home based on, an eviction at this time?
Yes, so this is something that happens even not during a pandemic. As Mr. Cervantes said, there's often bad actors, and even good laws can't eliminate all bad actors. So I think it's really important for tenants to know that the person who is authorized to evict you is the sheriff and people who work for the sheriff. So landlords are not allowed to, on their own, change the locks, throw your stuff into the street. That doesn't mean it doesn't happen. So and we have some tenants that have reached out to us saying, I've been locked out. My landlord changed the locks while I was gone because he said I had to get out by the end of the month based on a previous agreement or whatever. So what we're advocating is that if people are concerned that they're in that situation, there are things you can do to protect yourself. So when you leave the house, You could take your cell phone, your keys, and a recent utility bill that shows that you live there. And if your landlord changes the locks while you're gone, you pick up the phone and you call the police and you let them know, I'm waiting outside with proof that I live here, my landlord has changed the locks. And then don't engage further and wait till the police arrive. And that has been successful in some circumstances. So we just want tenants to know, and landlords too if they're watching, that they are not allowed to use what we call self-help in order to evict tenants, because the sheriff is not executing evictions right now, except for those very, very narrow exceptions where the court has determined it's a public safety issue.
Because there's some sort of criminal activity taking place in the house or something was going on?
Honestly, it really hasn't been tested because
Oh.
this is all very new. So we're really not sure what falls into that public safety exception, and that's why we're advising people that if you receive documents from the court, whether it's a letter saying notice of unlawful detainer, which is just another word for an eviction case, that you reach out to a legal advocate or to HSID, preferably both, as soon as you can to try to determine what's going on in your particular situation.
And of course, protecting people from being unhoused in this scenario is priority number one, and especially in regards to this conversation. But you know, you have taken action to protect those that before this pandemic hit were unhoused, in particular in your district, have you not?
We have, and we're going to continue doing that. You know, we've got an obligation to serve the families, kids in our district. We're committed to doing that and making sure that individuals are aware of their rights, responsibilities, but also the resources that are here to help. And the city is a friend. It wants to be helpful.
Have you noticed citywide that there have been resources available to the unhoused that you've not seen in the past?
Yeah, I mean, there's been an unprecedented effort to lease hotels, try to get people into hotel rooms, you know, the rec centers being taken over. But unfortunately, the homelessness crisis in Los Angeles is so massive that everywhere you go, you still see encampments. And so, you know, as an advocate, and our team also represents people who are currently experiencing homelessness as well. We're very concerned about them, and it's very hard for us to advocate for them because of social distancing and safer at home. So we're doing the best we can via phone and email, but it's a very difficult time to be a person experiencing homelessness right now.
And also in high density population areas, the whole issue of social distancing is I would imagine very problematic, not just now, but in the future.
Well, it's very difficult. You know, you have people who are poor, struggling, kind of working to make ends meet, sometimes working 2, sometimes 3 jobs, living in cramped corners with friends or with family. You know, they don't have the luxury of being able to have a separate room or a separate area. And so it just exacerbates, you know, these problems, these concerns, and these challenges. But we can't run from them. We've got to go to them and try to resolve them.
Are you saying the same with the people that you work with?
Definitely, and it was already a significant problem in our practice that people are crowded into apartments. You know, we see 5 to 8 people living in a 2-bedroom on the regular, you know, 4 people in a 1-bedroom. It's very common for people to be doubled up and in very cramped quarters, and that places their housing at risk because oftentimes, you know, the landlord takes the position that you're over occupancy, you have too many occupants in your apartment, and it's now creating a health risk as well as generally just a quality of life issue when you don't really have space to live your life. But there's one sort of point that I want to emphasize, which is that this situation is dynamic. And we understand that creates a lot of anxiety and confusion for tenants, but it also is creating a lot of opportunity for advocacy. So think about joining your local tenants union, getting together with other people in your building, talking to your neighbors, and figuring out what are the things that you can advocate for and be active in your community to benefit you and the people that you know, because it's a time of tremendous change. And you know, we're seeing that the city council and the governor is receptive to sort of changes in business as usual. So, you know, there's some opportunity here for things to be changed for the positive for renters in Los Angeles.
You know, we've been talking about staying, but what if somebody wants out? What if somebody wants to break their lease? They're in a year lease, a 2-year lease or something like that, and given the current circumstances, they've changed their heart and mind. Maybe they want to go back to a different part of the country. Maybe they know that even after this is over, they're not going to be able to repay the money that they're due. Are there any rights or privileges to be able to break a lease right now?
You know, I think that's a tough question, and it's not something that has really been addressed by any of the legislation that's been passed. But I think it's definitely something to think about, and I think it's something to, see if you can work something out with your landlord, because, if the landlords have an opportunity to get someone in who can pay the rent, that could be to their advantage, but also to seek legal assistance to see, this is something that our team has done, is try to negotiate with landlords about breaking the lease. But one thing I want to emphasize is, if you don't have somewhere that is safe to go, that you can afford to live, stay in place. We see tenants who are anxious and worried, and they just want to be done with their landlord situation. They're like, you know what, I'm just going to move. I'm ready to go. I'll figure something out. That's very dangerous right now. And we don't want people to be in a situation where they don't have protections legally and they're in a precarious health situation, because we want to make sure that people are in places where they're safe and where they can actually pay their rent. So we're advising people to stay where you are unless you have a really great option B, stay in place.
And again, that's why it's important to maintain that communication with the landlord, explaining your situation, explaining what the circumstances are, maybe even referring the landlord to HCID to receive additional information or more updated information. We've got to be able to make sure people are aware of what their responsibilities are and opportunities are. But communication is very, very important. And that's why events like this hopefully will get the word out and encourage others to spread that word as well.
Well, let's end on a good word, because you've been doing some very wonderful things in your district. You've been reaching out, helping your community. So you've testing and masks. There's resources available.
Lots of resources. We're exciting. 2 weeks ago, we opened up the first testing site in South LA in CD9, a walk-up site at Kedron Mental Health. And yesterday, the mayor announced that anyone who wants to be tested can be tested. So
at what cost?
At no cost. At no cost.
That's important to say.
At no cost. They've got to sign up and to get on that list. But everyone will be welcomed. Initially, we were only testing the first responders, but now anyone that wants a test can get a test. That's important. We've been providing gloves and masks to some of our medical institutions and medical clinics. That has made a great deal. We have a feeding program for our seniors, and we're serving over the next couple of months more than 20,000 meals to seniors who are unable to go out to get their meals or unable to go to the senior center to receive their meals. So we're trying to meet individuals where they are. We mentioned the efforts at our rec centers to house those who are homeless or who have been homeless or on the verge of being homeless. Again, trying to provide some options and some opportunities and some resources. We can't do enough because there is such a great need. But I'm always enthused and encouraged by the outpouring of support, the volunteerism of our citizens, those who live in the district and those who come to the district to help. And the help is greatly appreciated and it's muchly needed.
And Silvana, it's so nice to know that there are people like you who are advocating for those who don't necessarily have the wherewithal to be able to advocate for themselves.
Well, we really appreciate our partnership with Public Counsel because they have been stepping up to the plate for a long time, not just here in CD9, not just in South LA, but really responding to those communities of need and providing the much needed legal assistance to make things happen. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And for all the tenants out there, we're here for you, and we look forward to serving you as much as we can.
All right. Well, Silvana and Curren, thank you very much. Keep up the good work, and it's been a joy speaking with you, and I'm sure that a lot of people appreciate all this great information.
Thank you.
Thank you.